Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather here with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to give you a quick debrief on last night's school board meeting. And we're here today with our resident expert on literacy, Sarah Freeman. How are y'all doing this morning?
Good today. I mean, some of us are in our feelings, but good day.
How are you doing today, or Sarah?
You know, um, in my feelings, but happy to be part of this conversation and just keeping my eyes on the horizon. I think we're all striving toward.
Yeah. Well, so just to give people a quick recap of what went down last night during this committee of the whole meeting, the school board received a presentation from district administration and staff on data from last year's screeners and last year's assessments that they were able to give in order to start this school year off. And it seemed like to really lay the foundation for what their plan around literacy and math is going to be going into this year. I use the term plan loosely. And so we thought it'd be great to have this conversation today with Sarah to talk about two things. One, really looking at, it felt like the data, if you were just reading the presentation by yourself, was pretty upsetting, but then the tone of the school board meeting was a little different than that. And then also just diving into some of the literacy things that were a surprise and maybe we should be a little bit more critical of. And so I want to start by asking both of you again, as parents in this district, when you saw that data, what were you expecting to hear from both the school board and the district leadership last night?
Well, I think for me, I was expecting to hear a much more urgent tone. To me, the data and what we're looking at for our students after, some of our students haven't been in buildings for 15 months. And also, we know that by looking at the data that we are still, our learning loss is still falling heavily along racial lines. And
Mm.
so I was really listening for a sense of urgency and then a plan, right? We have a lot of extra money coming into our district right now. We have a lot of resources that we typically don't have. And then we have this really great need. And what I heard last night was a really polite conversation that felt like we were looking at very different data than what we were looking at.
Okay.
Yeah, I described it as kind of a Kennedy Nixon debate dynamic. I had read through the district's materials prior to last night's presentation, and it seemed a steady drumbeat of data demonstrating that there is an urgent problem, and that urgent problem predates COVID and distance learning. And then the conversation last night was, polite's a good word to describe it. Not impassioned. I didn't hear the sense of urgency and emergency that I hear when talking to parents or educators in the district, or even folks from the Minnesota Department of Education that we've connected with recently. Last night sounded very different than those other conversations, and that was remarkable to me.
So if I was somebody that watched the school board meeting, but if I wasn't paying as close attention and I haven't had this conversation with either of you already, um, you know, it makes sense to me that last night the school board would and the school district would say, yeah, we had some losses due to the pandemic. Why are y'all claiming that this isn't just due to the pandemic? Because there were some slides that showed that in the previous year there was some real growth that was made, but then it dipped back after or throughout the pandemic. And so why are y'all not accepting that explanation from the school district?
Well, I think like our students, our kindergartners don't know their letter names and sounds. Like literally what I heard, and I know I'm switching a little bit to math, but our kindergartners don't know their numbers through 31. Like they don't know how to go front to back. What we are talking about the fact that like when we're saying like we made a little bit of growth, we made a little bit of growth in some area and then we regressed right back down. But the things that we are not making growth in are so foundational to what our students must have. And what we know is that if our students are not making this up by the end of a kindergarten year, that they are going to fall further and further behind. Like you can't get more foundational than letter names and sounds, and we are not doing that. Also, what we heard was like we don't have a real plan for how they're going to get their letter names and sounds, or what is going to be different about their instruction this year versus the other years where they didn't know their letter names and sounds.
And this, you know, for me, these aren't just data on the page. You know, my kindergartner finished kindergarten not knowing letter names and letter sounds. She couldn't count to 31. She couldn't count to 20 and go, you know, 220 and then back to 1. And my soon to be fourth grader had similar struggles pre-COVID in MPS classrooms, didn't develop those foundational skills in kindergarten and first grade. And, you know, in second and third grade, those chickens came home to roost because they prevented all of his other learning. And so I saw the problems that had seeded themselves in kindergarten and first grade flower. And it's a fucking mess. And my family can pull the privilege lever. We can get my fourth grader the private tutoring that he needs to develop these basic foundational skills. It looks like we'll have to do that for our youngest as well. But there are thousands of kids in this district who don't have the option to privatize their education in that way. And the district doesn't seem to be acknowledging that that's a problem or in any way articulating their plan to address it. And so I saw last night's presentation as an attempt at rebranding what they were doing. You know, all of a sudden the phrase structured literacy is on these slides. MPS does not use a structured literacy curricula. It does not employ structured literacy practices either in the core classroom or in its interventions. I call bullshit on the appropriation of the term structured literacy. You know, if you just looked at last night's presentation, you would think MPS was doing okay and had a solid plan to do better. And I think, you know, that just belies the truth, which is that neither of those two things were in place last night.
Yeah, you know, I think in previous conversations, you know, we've talked also about this idea of like toxic positivity. And so this idea that like we can just go ahead and say, you know what, we don't praise this thing enough, we don't praise that thing enough. And at times that's true, right? We don't always talk about what's going right across the district. But when you lay out the information, the data that they're laying out, and we know that they are like, the pandemic was just murderous to the academic gains and the academic outcomes and the academic achievement of students across the district. It just felt really, it felt like, yeah, like I don't feel confident that our school board, either one, has the urgency to hold our superintendent and our staff accountable to like doing what they need to do, and then two, you know, thinking about like what's the plan, like having an idea of what the plan really should be. Because if it's me, right, and I'm like, I don't know what to do, then I'm just going to try to focus on other things, right? Instead of laying out like really clearly, here's the problem, and I know what to do in order to fix it, or here are some of the things that I want to do in order to fix it. But you know, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but right, we're just like digging into like, we know what's right, we know what we want to do, even though everything and everyone around us is saying that we may not be going in the strongest direction. And so I think that's the challenge. And so for me, another question that I want to ask y'all, and I'll answer it too, but is thinking about the role that the school board really wants to play, especially this board with this superintendent, seems to be like we are in the space of governance, which I think is a big and significant and at times good shift from being like, we are going to want to be in the nitty gritty. We want to like be making management decisions, all these kinds of things. They've swung away from that over the last several years to being strictly about governance, and the way that they want to hold like the district accountable for academics is through the evaluation of the superintendent. Do you all believe that is enough for the school board to be doing in order to address some of the like academic challenges that we see currently and that we were shown last night?
You know, I think for me the concern that I have is that when I do hear really good questions, there were different board members that asked good questions last night and they did not get solid answers. And so, you know, we've seen again and again and again when it comes to academics, our school board members who ask the hard questions either don't get answered or kind of get a very polite get back in your lane sort of an answer. Um, so I mean I have real concerns about I mean I heard board members asking things last night like I need middle school data, right? And like yep, we can get you that, but that seems like it should have been part of the presentation that we heard last night.
Yeah, and I struggle, perhaps a focus on governance is the sort of organizing principle of the board ethos right now, but I don't know what they have to show for that in terms of actual accountability. You know, governance is ultimately just a fancy word for ensuring accountability. Superintendent Graff, this is his 5th year. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, I think
is it his 5th school year? You know, they praised him last night for having a curriculum, but a literacy curriculum, but he doesn't have a literacy plan, and he hasn't in his tenure. The data, other than, you know, an anomalous year that they pointed to last night where you know, some growth was shown. The data look today very similar to what they looked like when Ed Graff, you know, took the helm of MPS. And so if governance truly is the focus, then I would think harder questions requiring follow-up, you know, and entertaining the notion that maybe the superintendent doesn't have all the answers, and that the board, you know, through its role can push the superintendent and the cabinet towards some of those answers. But I don't see the pushing, I don't see the prodding, I don't see the follow-up. You know, directors Elamine and director Sabrio have consistently asked, you know, specific good questions and gotten non-responses. And so I'm sort of at a loss to explain or understand the board's approach to this. I'm really at a loss on the board, because the data don't match what is being presented and sort of propagated as reality. The data just don't match those. And so explaining that gap, that's what governance and accountability looks like, and we don't have it yet.
Yeah, you know, I really struggle because I feel like I think the board really relies on the staff for the academic like leadership of the district, which is important, which is great. And as people who are a part of the electorate that elects school board members, I don't think we do enough necessarily to actually interrogate our school board members' understanding of like academics, right? And like teaching and learning, and you know, all these kind of things. Like we, as an electorate, like we focus on so many of the wrong things constantly. It's really gross and it's really sick. Like we're like, oh, school choice. Tell me the last time we had a real conversation that the board ever had to make a decision about school choice. They're talking about enrollment, sure, but like they have no say as to, they're not starting charter schools. They're not, you know, whatever. And so I think that's really a challenge, right? And then we have conversations about testing, and we ask people to run based on like, what do you think about testing? Well, now we have data that is incomplete, or we don't value, or we're not making data-driven decisions. We're not having data-driven discussions, and we're just pie in the sky. Oh, you know what? The new standard is that a school district has a literacy curriculum. I'm sorry. I think every school district can have a literacy curriculum. That doesn't seem like a challenge, selecting and purchasing a curriculum. I know that it is a big piece of work to like identify it, but like having a curriculum shouldn't be the bar. Our students excelling should be the bar. And I think, you know, as much as this is on like trying to figure out like the school board and like what role are they trying to play, if you don't have a school board who can really push back, who can really dig deep and understand the like academic data and information that the superintendent and, you know, the cabinet is putting in front of them, then it's really hard. And so you do get good questions around accountability that, like Heather, you were saying, or sorry, you were saying, I think about Director Cerrillo and Director Elamine asking last night, and they have consistently asked, but like we have three former teachers maybe on the school board right now. And I think it was really disappointing that we only heard from two and one didn't say anything last night about any of this. It just doesn't feel like the board has the skill set and the capacity or the willingness to, or the urgency to like push and demand more, at least publicly. Maybe they're doing so privately, and that we don't know, but it's not showing up in what we're getting in public presentations following up, right? Like this is now presentation probably 5 on literacy now in the last 10 months, and we aren't getting anything significantly different. We're not seeing any changes. We're not seeing shifts. We're just kind of seeing the same old. And so going into that conversation, Sarah, I want to hear from you. Like, what did you notice? What were you paying close attention to during the conversation about literacy last night specifically?
You know, I was I guess I was struck more by the rebranding attempt, you know, the word structured literacy being sort of peppered throughout the slides last night really stuck out to me, because MPS, you know, as I mentioned, does not use a structured literacy curriculum nor, you know, intervention practices. So I was really struck by that rebranding. I think most struck by the district's assertion that vendor training is the same as professional development. You know, what stuck out to me last night in both the slides and the presentation was that what is being offered as professional development is really just vendor training. So teachers are going to be
why isn't vendor training the same as professional development? What's the difference to you?
You know, to me, the difference to me is one of strategy versus tactics, right? Vendor training is very tactical. It's how to use a specific tool in specific ways. Mm-hmm. So MPS has PRESS, which is a new intervention that some teachers will receive training on. And then Dr. Fearing also referenced some additional training around benchmark. You know, those are going to be very practical trainings around a specific tool. Professional development, as the name implies, is developing the whole teacher, whether it's in pedagogy or strategic practices in the classroom. And the professional development that the Minnesota Department of Education has recommended all teachers receive, which will be part of its state literacy plan coming out this fall, which is, you know, being piloted through a grant program passed by the state legislature in June, is professional development rooted in the science of reading. So our MPS teachers are going to learn more about benchmark and they're going to learn about this new press intervention. But they are not going to receive basic foundational training in the science of reading and how to teach reading, writing, and spelling. And we've seen other districts and other states implement letters training with tremendous success and embrace the science of reading more broadly with a tremendous impact. And what I noticed last night was MPS trying to sell us vendor training as PD, and the fact that, you know, more than $100 million in ARP and ESSER 3 money is coming into the district, and we are not going to invest $1 in ensuring that elementary teachers are trained in the science of reading. And that flies in the face of Department of Ed recommendations, other states' experiences with balanced and structured literacy and the science of reading. And it just flies in the face of the reality in our district when you've got a majority of kindergarten and first grade students not mastering basic literacy skills. You have a core instruction problem. And you can't vendor train your way out of that. That requires a bigger picture, broader investment in true professional development.
The other thing that I noticed, and I do want to bring up, is the fact that we talked about an app that any person can download as one of our major tools that we are looking to. You know, when my children were young, we received speech services from our school district. And I can't tell you, it was my responsibility to put my 2 children in a car, to bring them into a school, to receive services, and to drive them home, right? So lots of transition time, driving, big dedication. One of the most frustrating things to me as a parent was that many times my children were put on an app and an iPad when they were receiving speech services. So all I did then was say, fine, if I'm going to put them in a car, deal with tantrums, and then drive back home, I'll just download the app myself. But I don't necessarily know how much confidence I have in the fact that I saw an app that any person can buy as like a huge part of our literacy success. I certainly think that apps can be helpful. And I think it's great that we have a one-to-one district now and that students can be using that. But I was really concerned about the amount of time and energy that an app was given in last night's presentation. I saw it on many different slides.
Yep. Well, and having watched Lexia, you know, having watched 2 struggling readers struggle with Lexia for a year, they got nothing, less than nothing out of it. Because what the skills Lexia was sort of not testing, but giving them practice at, were not skills that were being explicitly and systematically taught in their classroom. And we can attribute this to distance learning, but my son's entire tutoring experience after his dyslexia diagnosis was online and virtual. And I've seen, with him, the power of explicit systematic instruction, even if it's online. But to tout Lexia as differentiated instruction, which is what it was hailed as last night, it is a joke, is an absolute joke. And that was, I think, the part at which I had to go for a walk while I listened to this, because I just had to kind of walk out the rage at that point.
Yeah, I think for me, what continues to be an issue in this literacy conversation is I don't know what problem the district is trying to solve.
Yep.
Or
poverty seems to be the only identified problem, right?
Right.
And we blame that when we don't want to acknowledge what's really going on in our classrooms.
Right. And so when you say what MDE's guidance is, if 20% of your students, more than 20% of your students are needing interventions, like that's a core instruction problem, right? Like does MPS see it that way? Do they see their issues in core instruction? Do they see, it feels like, if I had to guess, but again, I don't know, it feels like they didn't believe they had the proper like intervention system in place when students fell behind. So once a student fell behind, they had no way to intervene. They had no way to identify and intervene. And so it feels like they've been trying to build that up for years now. I think the problem is, and the thing that I've heard you and David both, mention is, why do we have so many students like needing to get into interventions in the first place? Like, we need to fix this further upstream and not just say, oh, okay, we have now a really good intervention system. And I don't even know if it's really good. I'm not saying that it is. I'm not saying that it isn't. It just feels like, that's been the problem that they've been trying to solve. But it doesn't feel like that's ever really been clearly identified as the problem, because there's also been conversations about implementation, and that's why we can't question benchmark. There's been, then there's been a whole other host of issues around the use of testing and what assessments we're using and all that. And so it just doesn't feel like there's a cohesive understanding for maybe administration, but certainly the board, as to like, what problem are we trying to solve, so that now as a board member, I can ask, great, what are we doing about it? How long is it going to take? What resources do you need? And like, how can we evaluate, that this is working or not, or if this is the right problem? We can't even have an honest discussion about if this is the right problem or not, because we're not identifying what the problem is. And I don't know why they're shying. And I don't think it's fair necessarily to say, it's as simplistic as like one thing that is the problem, right? Like, there are probably a lot of different things that are feeding into our literacy issues, but we have to have a priority and a focus around like, what is the thing that we're trying to address first, second, third, because we can't tackle it all at once, because we're spreading our resources, both money and staff time and PD or whatever, too thin to address it all. Even though you have to have urgency, but you can't, like, you also have to have priorities.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a good point, and it's probably one of the factors in why we don't have a literacy plan. A true plan must begin with what the problem is, right? A plan is trying to go from point A to point B. The problem with point A is, this, and we got to get to point B, and here's how we're going to do it. MPS has never identified a problem. I heard Senior Officer Moore several times state last night that the problem is basically baked into the pie by third grade. The opportunity gap, the achievement gap is sort of fully formed by the end of third grade. So what's the problem in K3 that you're trying to identify and solve for, right? Like, I understand that why we don't have a plan, because so far, to your point, Kenneth, there's been no explicit statement of these are the problems that we see. One of the things we've been asking for a year is an audit of benchmarks efficacy, an audit of core instruction practices and materials. We can't, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's not. Maybe that audit would show that benchmark is great and 11 other states have just got it wrong. But I suspect that's not the case. And you can't, proceed along a plan with any fidelity to that plan if you haven't identified the problem you're trying to address.
That's right.
The two things that I would say that I've heard clearly be identified as a problem, and this also is the thing that just rubs me the wrong way a lot, is especially this first one around like, oh, we know that that the achievement gap is at the door, like it's coming in the door at kindergarten. Like, we already know like 40% or whatever the percentage they see is like coming in the door at kindergarten. So it immediately puts the blame on students. Like, the students are the problem, the families are the problem. Like you said, poverty is the problem. All things that, like, really Minneapolis Public Schools does not have any type of like power to solve. And so the second thing that I always hear is also coming into the door, our teachers don't know how to teach literacy, right? And I hear this all the time. And so it's like you have to talk to the schools of ed. And I understand that MPS is part of a larger education system that feeds into a lot of different things, but it just feels like you see everyone else as the problem and you're trying to put on band-aids for everyone else's problem. But then we have data that shows, oh, well, actually the achievement gap grows while students are in your classrooms every single day. By the time 3 years, like by the time they're in third grade, like you said, it's baked into the pie. And then by the time they're in third grade, it just like exacerbates through high school. And so I get really frustrated because it just kind of feels like everyone's abdicating responsibility. And like, yeah, at schools of ed, you need to do a much, much better job of teaching teachers how to teach literacy. Like that, like that's definitely a thing that they have to focus on. How can we work with, early childhood, preschool, daycare, whatever, to support, early literacy development? Sure. And MPS, like, what are you doing to make sure that you don't have any core instruction issues? You don't have, curriculum issues. You don't have implementation and fidelity of implementation issues with your teachers. Like, are you baking it into your evaluations? Are you regularly auditing things that need to be audited? But it just feels like we're like, you know what, we're so far behind the ball because of these problems that we've identified as, students are coming in with the achievement gap, teachers are coming in not knowing. So we're just going to like rely back on interventions and allow basically our literacy curriculum and plan just be a set of interventions like time and time and time again as students continue to fall further and further behind. And that seems like a broken system to me.
Well, and to quote one of my favorite teachers, Nafisa Muhammad Wright, she said, basically, when it comes to students of color, all we do is just play a big old game of pass the potato, pass the responsibility. And I would have liked last night to have seen a board who had a much more honest conversation. I would have liked to have seen a lot more I don't knows and we aren't doing this well. That would have given, I mean, yeah. I just, that after this many literacy presentations, we are still acting like we have a plan when it is clear that we do not have a plan. I feel deeply frustrated and very concerned.
Yeah. Any last thoughts for you, Sarah?
Yeah, I just, I'm disappointed. David and Kulia and I are marking the, 1 year anniversary of forming the MPS academic advocacy group and are organizing around literacy. And we don't have anything to show for it. In fact, the same questions we were asking of the district a year ago, those questions remain largely unanswered. Basic questions like if a majority of students aren't mastering basic foundational skills in early elementary, do you have a core instruction problem? Do you have a plan to invest in and train educators in the science of reading and reading instruction? And so I guess at the 1 year mark of so many of those questions being unanswered, I'm disappointed in the responses. But I'm proud to stand with organizers like Kulia and David and all the others who've joined the fight. And I'm just imploring others, to join us, because the district's message seems to be, we got this. And they don't got this. And it's going to take pushing. If the board isn't going to push, it's going to take, parents and family members and community members to push us toward progress.
Yeah, I would say, even though, last night's presentation, I don't think last night's presentation should be the bellwether around whether y'all have been successful or not, or what y'all have accomplished. Because, the fact that there's been 5 or 6 literacy presentations in a single year from them is mind-boggling. Like, they haven't presented this often in literacy ever since I've been watching, school board meetings. So I think that's significant. They made literacy a priority for this year. The board made literacy a priority. And when I watched their board retreat, they were consistently talking about literacy being something that they want to, and like foundational academics in general, being something that they want to show up as a priority in their strategic plan. And so while we're not seeing the change in philosophy and that might reach the classroom anytime soon, I do think at least the conversation is now open to the public to now be critical, like we had the chance to now be critical and continue to ask questions and to continue to prod, is this matching what MDE is saying? Is this matching what other states are saying? Because before it was like such a closed door conversation, and with a board that has been a little bit more hesitant to talk about academics, I don't know if it would have happened unless y'all started pushing. So I think y'all have done a lot of good work.
Well, appreciate that, Kenneth.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us. Heather, it's good to be back doing this together. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.